Good evening, everyone, and welcome to FCC License Exams webinar number 4. Today, we're going to be discussing several topics on our website regarding the commercial license, but we'll be going over those in just a minute. We'll be talking about in our main class on how the ionosphere works. I'm Charles Pascal. I'm the person who is going to be providing you this webinar, and we'll take a look at our first slide. Our first slide is our 45-minute webinar, which is going to teach you basically how to pass FCC commercial license exams. We'll be doing that by even providing you sample questions from FCC tests. Now, I'm teaching a class from a boat, believe it or not, located in Marina del Rey, just a little bit north of the Los Angeles airport. My wife and I have lived on this boat for over 20 years, and since then we've been very devoted to marine operations and commercial licenses. This has been our life, and we are delighted to be able to share this knowledge with you. So we'll be doing this from a boat in the Marina del Rey, and we're broadcasting from the houseboat now. As far as my teaching credentials are concerned, I've been teaching for 39 years. I hold a Master's of Arts in Education from Loyola Marymount University. I've taught at the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, Pepperdine University, Loyola Marymount, several places, and I have taught people how to pass FCC license exams. So now we'll take a look at what are the topics that we're going to be covering in this webinar. The first thing we'll be talking about, Forbes study. Why is it important to validate your knowledge? This is very important. We'll get to that in just a moment. Then we're going to be talking about a sample class on how the ionosphere works. Because as a commercial license electronics officer, you're going to need to know how the ionosphere works. Whether you're operating with conventional shortwave or Inmarsat, or whether you're operating with the internet, knowing about the ionosphere is a very key part of your knowledge. Then at the end, we're going to be providing GROL and GMDSS job listings just to show you that when you graduate, what are the job titles that you can apply for. Now let's take a look at our Forbes study. Why is it important? Well, Forbes did a study a couple of years ago, and they found out that 70% of the resumes that are turned in to employers contain either stretched or false information. Now, that's what Forbes says, but this has been backed up by a series of economic studies completed by Harvard, Yale, several other business schools, and they range data from 55 to 70%. So you have to take a look and think, if you are an HR person and you are being bombarded with this material, this is going to be of great concern to you. If I'm getting resumes where between 55 and 70% of the information is false, what can I do about it? One way is to find some third party way of verifying a person's credentials. Now, in our FCC license exams, we validate through federal licenses because the United States courts, the federal courts and state courts have considered the federal government the highest validator of licenses for telecommunications. If you're in the IT field, just to kind of provide a little off topic for a second, there are private certifications. Microsoft has their MCSE, Oracle has their database administrator. CompTIA has many excellent certifications for cybersecurity, computer repair. They even have one for network penetration testing, which is excellent. EC Console has their certified ethical hacking. Cisco has a great certification class. But the bottom line is that why all this exists is that it exists for one reason. Employers have to have a way to validate credentials because we have good schools. They're in the country, but we also have schools that are not providing the education that is required. Teaching to a test, going over things in a very rapid way. So when students graduate, they actually believe they know more than they actually do. So when they hit their resumes, hit the HR department, the HR has to have some way to validate. And having a certified credential is one way that an employer can say, well, I think I will give this candidate a interview so that I can validate if they've completed more study than just simply attending a class. That's why these validating with the FCC license is very important to you if you're looking for a job, because it is proof that you did complete a test outside the school of education that you attended. Our next topic is going to be talking about how the ionosphere works. Now, the federal communications exams for both amateur and commercial actually have test questions on the ionosphere and how they work, and we'll be taking some sample questions from these tests to provide explanations and show you A, how it works, but then how you will be tested on how the ionosphere works. Now, the ionosphere is involved in radio wave propagation, so we'll get to that in just a moment. The ionosphere refracts radio signals. It is the upper part of the Earth's atmosphere. It's approximately 37 to approximately 190 miles above the Earth's surface, and it will trap radio waves and refract them. Notice I did not say reflect, I said refract. That means the wave is re entering the Earth's atmosphere at an angle, because if it reflected, it would just bounce back to its original source. It's the refraction of the radio signal from the ionosphere that makes radio wave propagation possible. So the ionosphere has electrically charged gas particles, and these particles trap the electric and magnetic waves from the radio signal. And if it's the right wavelength coming at the right angle, these gas particles will refract the radio signal back to Earth at an angle. That's what causes radio waves to travel from one point to the other, is this refraction of the ionosphere. So radiation from the sun is what excites gases in this region. And that's what causes radio waves. So the sun to refract. So the sun is very much responsible for the refraction of radio waves back to Earth. The ionosphere has three layers, which we will cover: layer D, layer E, and layer F. And each one has a specific purpose, which we'll get into a little more as we talk to you about how the ionosphere works. So if we define radio wave propagation specifically, we are talking about how a radio wave travels from point A to point B. So right now, I have a web developing team that's in Serbia. So if I was to talk to that team in Serbia, and I would be using, say, right now at this time of day, 15 meters, 21 megahertz, the radio signals would be refracting from Los Angeles to Serbia, and we would be in communication. If I wanted to talk to Serbia in the evening, I'd be using 14 megahertz. So it's 15 meters now and 20 meters in the evening, because propagation has a lot to do with the time of day. If I wanted to talk to Japan, I would talk to Japan at 8 o'clock in the morning in Los Angeles using 20 meters or 14 megahertz now. So we'll get a little bit in. So basically, the time of day has a great deal to do with radio wave propagation and what band of frequencies you use. And I'm going to define that. What is a band? A band is a group of frequencies. So knowing which group or which band a certain wavelength belongs to is a very key element in defining radio wave propagation. If you know the band, you know the season, you know the time of day, we'll get to that in a few minutes, you'll be able to find out or determine what frequency to use to best talk to the area of the world or that you want to talk to. You can control your distance for your radio signal by understanding radio wave propagation. So the ionosphere basically, through radio wave propagation, considers how the radio wave travels through the D, E, and F layers of the ionosphere. Let's go on to our next slide. We're going to take a look at a question from the technician, T3A11. Which radio waves, which part of the atmosphere can refract or bend radio waves? So you take a look at the choices after what we just covered. Would it be the stratosphere? Would it be the troposphere, the ionosphere, the mesosphere? Well, if we take a look at the question, the correct answer is C, and that would be the ionosphere. So it comes back to exactly what we taught. And if you were taking the technician amateur test or you were taking one of the GMDSS tests, that question would come exactly on that form, that it would be the ionosphere that refracts or bends radio waves. So now you understand, even from a true theoretical point and from the FCC's point, how this can actually work for you. Let's take a look at T3B04 from the Technician Amateur Exam. What is the velocity of a radio wave traveling through free space? Well, is it speed of light, speed of sound, speed inversely proportional to the wavelength? Boy, is that a weird answer. I kind of enjoy that one. Speed increases as the frequency increases. Well, the answer, of course, is speed of light. So radio waves travel at the speed of light. Now, if you were in class for that, you would be given the speed of light, which is 186,000 miles per second. If you were to calculate that in meters, which we will be talking, it's 300 million meters per second. So 300 million meters per second is key because that 300 million is what's going to determine the wavelength or band that the group of frequencies belongs to. We'll go to the next slide. We'll take a look at T3B03. What are the two components of a radio wave? A radio wave has two components: impedance and reactance, voltage and current, electric and magnetic fields, ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. Correct answer is electric and magnetic fields. Now we'll go a little deeper into that. A radio wave has electric and magnetic fields, but it is the electric field that determines the polarization of a radio wave, whether it's traveling vertical or horizontal from a beam, because we covered that in the antenna webinar a couple of webinars ago. So the polarization, whether the wave is traveling vertically or horizontally, is determined by the electric field, which is 30 zeros stronger than the magnetic. The magnetic field is a very weak part of the radio wave, but yet the magnetic field does govern the radio wave quite a bit, even though it's the weakest part. The weakest part. So that's basically in microphysics as to how that would work. So always understand when you're thinking of polarization or setting the antenna, you want to always concentrate on the electric field. So the radio spectrum is divided into bands or groups of frequencies. So you go, well, how would I basically determine that? Well, that's a very interesting equation, and there's a way to do that. The formula is 300 slash F and MHZ, where 300 represents the speed of light in lambda, and F and MHZ represents the frequency. So if you were going to do 146 megahertz, 300 divided by 146, it's a little bit over 2. So you'd say, oh, there I'm in a band of frequencies located in the 2-meter band. Well, what if I wanted to be in the 6-meter band? Well, it'd be 6-meter band is 50 megahertz, so 300 divided by 50 would equal 6. So the idea is you get an idea as 300 over frequency in megahertz, what band or group of frequencies that this band belongs to, and this is going to be a very powerful element in determining radio wave propagation. So they cut 300 again represents the speed of light and what the mathematicians call lambda. So you're canceling out a bunch of zeros. You can determine it. This what wavelength that the band belongs to by using that formula. Let's go to our next slide. Ionospheric layers. The D layer is very interesting. Now, the D layer blocks signals on lower frequencies under 10 megahertz. So, what do we mean by that? Well, under 10 megahertz, you've got the AM broadcast band. You also have the 40-meter band for amateurs. You have the 8, 6, and 4, 2, 4, 6, and 8 uh, megahertz bands for boats. But the D layer does something very interesting. During the day, you have limited communication on these bands to basically ground wave, or maybe up on 8 megahertz, you can go maybe 3 or 400 miles because the D layer is actually blocking signals. Now, if we were going to look at that as far as how does that affect someone that's not an amateur radio operator and doesn't know about radios, take a look at your AM broadcast radio. You notice that if you tune on your AM radio during the day, you hear local stations in your area, and that's all you hear. But then in the evening, the D layer disappears and signals start to refract. Notice I didn't say reflect off the E layer. And when that happens, you start hearing signals from 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 1,000 miles away. And because those signals are bouncing off the E layer because there is no D layer, which is there in the daytime, to block those signals. So that D layer is very important, and it can be used if you want to limit your communication to 2, 3, 400 miles. And it can also be used if you want to expand your communication by the time of day of knowing when the D layer is there and when it's not. The D layer is available when the sun comes up, and the D layer goes away when the sun goes down. The E layer propagation of up to 2,000 miles during the evening, and the E layer is very active up to 10 megahertz. So, if you're wanting to work, if you're a vessel at sea, or you want to work, talk to stations or talk to them up to 2,000 miles away, you can do that very consistently on 8, 6, 4 megahertz using the E layer of the ionosphere. Actually, 8 megahertz works the best for that particular propagation. So the E layer is a very important aspect up to frequencies, again, repeating up to 10 MHz. The F layer provides worldwide propagation up to 30 MHz. So that band of 20 meters that I mentioned a while ago, that's 14 MHz, or 15 meters, 21 MHz. That's where, if I wanted to talk to my web developer on the radio in Serbia, I would use the F layer to speak with her. So we could talk if we were using the radio. We would be doing this under F layer propagation. So let's take a look at from some questions now from the GMDSS because it breaks down the bands and frequencies into specific categories. We're looking at 7B1. What is the frequency range for medium frequency? Very important if you're on a vessel or a boat. 10 to 30 MHz, 1000 to 10,000 KHZ, 300 to 3000 KHZ, 30 to 300 KHZ. The correct answer is C. The correct answer is C. 300 to 30 to 300 KHZ. So we'll take a look at that again. 300 to 3000 KHZ. I made a mistake there as it was reading. Okay, what's in that band? Medium frequency. There's where your AM broadcast band is. That's where that D layer has all of that effect during the day. Also, there's another part. If you're looking for a merchant marine or boat, there's a frequency down at 518 kilohertz called Navtex, the sending and receiving of narrowband direct printing, which you would use if your satellite or Inmarsat went out. So that's a very vital part to understand on that 7B1 question. What is the frequency range for high frequency? Now, high frequency, I'll just let you read the choices. We'll take a look. Take another look. And the correct answer is D, a 3 to 30 MHz. Now, what's on this one? Well, this one is very interesting because that's where your shortwave band comes. That's the frequency I would talk to Serbia on. That's the frequency range that I would use for worldwide communication. That's the frequency that if we ever had some major disaster and the internet went out, and if countries wanted to talk to the world, that's the bands we have to be geared up and ready to go. In the case that if there was a major emergency, that's where all the propagation would take place, and we would adjust our communications as to frequency and time of day. Let's take a look at our next slide. What's the frequency range for very high frequency? This is where all your local marine traffic would be located. Take a look at the frequencies. Take a very good look at those. A, 30 to 300 MHz, 30 to 300 MHz. Now that, what's in that area? Well, we have the marine channels, which starts at 156 to 162 MHz. We have and the amateur bands of 2 meters and 6 meters and 1 1/4 meters in that area. You also have some law enforcement in that area. The fire department uses the very lower part of the spectrum, around 40 MHz. So that's where you have, so you know a particular part. Now, an interesting part about this VHF is there are certain parts of that band, 40 to 50 MHz, where you can transmit signals over rolling hills or tricky terrain, because that band will allow you to do that in the wide open spaces, 30 to 40 MHz. So each different bands or group of frequencies has characteristics, and that 40 MHz works very well for the fire department. That's very important to know. So that is called VHF. We're going to look at UHF now. The frequency range for ultra high frequency, we'll take a look at the choices. The correct answer is B, 300 to 3000 MHz. Now, up on the UHF band, you have your handheld radios from ship to shore, or basically from ship to ship communication at sea. You have more law enforcement. You have amateur radio communications there. You also have commercial repeaters that can repeat or extend the range of radio signals. So as you're looking and we're covering all of this, you're seeing that each part of the ionosphere does a specific task. You can almost view the ionosphere as if you were viewing a tool to be used, as if you were building, constructing something. In this case, you're constructing communications, and the ionosphere is your perfect tool. This is known as the UHF, or ultra high frequency. I didn't put it in the slide, but there's an additional one called EHF, and that's where a lot of your radar is, and up in those frequencies. But I will also tell you that the higher in frequency you go, the shorter the wavelength becomes. So it's going to refract back at a different angle. So once a signal gets above 30 MHz, it converts from a worldwide angle to a line of sight, which, as far as your antenna can see, is as far as your antenna can talk. So knowing these different frequencies is going to enable you to have your propagation operate in a specific way. Let's go to our next slide. Which system is most likely to be affected by atmospheric disturbances? You take a good look at that, and we'll go through them. VHF DSC, Inmarsat, MSHF radio telephony, safety NETTM. The correct answer is HF radio telephony. Well, that's where you're going to use the ionosphere, because the ionosphere, even though we have that F layer, it is the area that is going to be most affected by ionospheric disturbances. That is your F layer, the layer most affected by ionospheric disturbances. Now, the next question, 8B4 from GMDSI, which is least susceptible. We had the one that was most susceptible. Now we're least susceptible to ionospheric disturbance. Take a look at them. The correct answer is A, Inmarsat, least affected by ionospheric disturbances. Why? because Inmarsat is up there in that uh, basic UHF part of the spectrum. It's basically a direct line of sight link from the satellite to the Earth because we're using the satellite's line of sight. So ionospheric disturbances will least affect satellite communications. That's why satellites have been uh, become so prominent, all the way from your LEO low Earth orbiting satellites to your geostationary to your MEO satellites, all of them in different heights, because the satellite signals are least susceptible to ionospheric disturbance. The only time a satellite might encounter it is if you had a massive solar flare that could disrupt the satellites. It's very rare, but for about 98% of the time, your satellite communication is going to be extremely reliable, and you should be able to communicate with a satellite with no problem. So let's take a look at our next slide with propagation rules of thumb, because generally propagation will work, but there are times that it will not work. We'll take a look at 96J1. What are the rules necessary to select the appropriate frequency? So you notice the radio operator is out there actually trying to select the appropriate frequency to complete the communications they need to do for a specific assignment. So, what are they doing for the appropriate frequency band? Let's take a look at the answers. The correct here is shorter distance equals lower frequency, daytime equals higher frequency. Well, we explained that. The shorter distance, the lower frequency, because we got that D layer, and then higher frequencies for longer distances because we can use the F layer, because on the higher frequencies we can go right through that D layer and go directly to the F layer. So right there, that is a specific rule of thumb. So as a radio operator, so let's put that in practical terms. I'm a radio operator on board a ship, and the master of the ship says, well, we're out here off of Hawaii, but I really need to get communications to Seattle, Washington. It's 10 o'clock in the morning. Can you do it for me? On using the HF shortwave radio. Answer is yes, I can. And I would do it using the higher frequencies. Probably would start with 12 megahertz, and then I would go to 16 megahertz because those would be the higher frequencies not susceptible to the D layer, so I could communicate from Hawaii to Seattle. Now, would I do that normally today? Not really. That's if the satellite wasn't working or there was some obstruction to the satellite, because sometimes that can happen. Then I could do this as a backup so I would know what frequency to use when I wanted to communicate. Let's take a look at our same slide. What would be the most appropriate HF bands? HF is shortwave from communicating from San Francisco to Taiwan or the Philippines. So let's take a look at the answers, and we'll at the end explain it. Take a look at these answers. The correct answer is 16 or 22 MHC during daylight and 8 MHC during the evening. So during the day, I'm going to use 16 to 22 because right there I don't have to contend with the D layer. At night, the D layer is gone, and I'm hoping that I can get some F layer down in the 8 megahertz band. And if I can, I can communicate from the Philippines to San Francisco. So radio operators have to understand that there is this ionosphere. This is how it works. And if you understand the propagation, this will help you a great deal. Let's take a look at our next slide. GMDSS operators should focus on the factors affecting propagation. In what priority? Let's take a look and we'll give you the correct answer. Look at the choices. The correct answer is distance and time of day, seasonal variations, and solar flare alerts. All right, if you take a look at that, what does that mean? Distance and time of day, we covered it. Seasonal variations, well, that's one we haven't really covered because during the summer, propagation works in slightly a different method than it does during the winter. During the winter, propagation is much better over the South Pole. During the summer, propagation is much better over the North Pole. So As a result, sometimes that shifts the time of day and the bands that we can use. And we'll be getting to where you can find some informational sources about that in a couple of minutes. So, understanding the seasons and understanding where we are in the sunspot cycle, if there's any solar flares, all of those come into uh, play when it comes to radio wave propagation and determining how all of this works. Now, where do we get the information? We get it from WWV. Now, WWV is a station broadcast by the National Bureau of Standards and Technology. They broadcast signals on 2.5, 5, 10, 15, and 20 megahertz. And they give the time every minute, which is universal coordinated universal standard time. And I think it's about every uh, 15 minutes in, they will actually give you the sunspot and solar update. Spaceweather.com is another source if you wanted to do it on the internet, has very accurate propagation information. And then your third source, which amateurs use, and it's really great if you want to understand solar flux and the sunspot number, is the K7RA solar update, because that will give you information about the flux. When the solar flux is high, and propagation is not as will not work as well when the solar flux is low. And K7RA, I won't go into all the numbers because we'd be here for a long time as to what they mean. But the K7RA solar update actually gives you the various numbers so you can actually calculate and determine how the particular conditions of the bands or frequency are that you want to operate on. And that's a very powerful uh, development to use as a radio operator because it makes you highly effective when you're communicating, knowing how to use these propagations. We'll take a look at 96J5. Which statement concerns frequency band and propagation most? That corresponds with standard practice. Take a look. They will give you the correct answer in a second. Propagation rules of thumb are usually sufficient for routine operations. So when I gave you the generally propagations for the season, time of day, the general propagation rules of thumb are very accurate and they'll work. They'll work a large percentage of the time, except when there is a solar flare or some disturbance in the ionosphere itself. Now we'll take a look. We're going to our next slide, and we're going to talk about the various types of general radio telephone operators jobs. Now we're not talking. What I did when I scanned these jobs, folks, is that I decided that it would be better just to kind of give you the job title because pay information and all that can vary. Whether the job is open, it was open as of a couple of days ago. They could be hiring, but the point is that if you have these titles, you know specifically what types of jobs to search for. So every week we'll include the job titles and we'll call it what we'll exactly call it, job title search. Because when I have taught at a technical school, Avco Technology, the one thing I learned, a lot of students when they graduated, they had no idea what job titles to search for. So we corrected that. So when they do graduate, they can say, well, I can search for this, this, and this. So if you get your general radio telephone and you get your GMDSS license, each week will include specific job titles that you can search for. So it'll better help you to locate some job that you want to do. So let's take a look at our job titles. Senior Communications Technician, P25. Well, that's a senior communication technician stands out. But there's something that stands out even more. At the very end, the letter's P25. Oh, we got law enforcement. That means encrypted communication. So if you understand about P25, that means an understanding of Motorola radios and how it works, because law enforcement uses a lot of Motorola's. That's a very interesting job to apply for, because one thing for sure, in law enforcement for communications using P25, you will always have work. Field service technician. That could be for anything. It's basically installing radios for taxi cabs. It could be installing radios for delivery service. It could be installing all kinds of radios for maybe uh, land mobile, field service technician. That does require, for many companies, a general radio telephone operator's license exam. Installation technician, basically the same thing, but if you pull it up, it will pull up a different series of jobs than field service technician. So you want to pull up installation as well, so you get an idea if that's what you want to do. That will give you an idea of the types of jobs that are available. Aircraft technician, airframe and power plant. Well, what does that mean? Well, airframe and power plant's a very good job. You're fixing jet aircraft, but in order to enter the cockpit and in order to basically just the navigational equipment, the radar, the communications equipment in the cockpit, the license you have to have is a general radio telephone. And they require also the radar endorsement because you may be working with the radar and the transponder systems and altimeter of the aircraft. So you're going to need the general radio telephone license with that radar endorsement. Avionics instructor. That's one that's going to need the general radio telephone instructor if you're teaching. I've been looking at a couple of colleges. That is a requirement for the general radio telephone. If you're going to be teaching avionics, many colleges require you to have the general radio telephone license exam for that. Radio communications technician supervisor, that means you're going to be supervising a department with many technicians, some having the license, some not, but you'll be signing off on all of their repairs. Radio tech journeyman, that's an entry level job, but it requires a general radio telephone license. You could be fixing radios at any point. Let's take a look at our next slide, and this one's going to be GMDSS jobs. Now, there are many here, but we'll just take a look at a couple of titles and briefly go over what they mean. Marine Service Technician, San Francisco. Well, why would that require it? Well, you're probably going to be running tests on equipment on board ship, and that would be equipment like a Furuno or types of equipment that's going to be engaged in international and satellite communication. So you're going to need all your GMDSS along with your general radio telephone license for that. A marine electronics technician, Seattle, Washington, the same thing. You're going to be going over and fixing international equipment because as ships pull in for either inspection, we'll be covering that in another webinar at some point. You're going to be needing that. First officer, SDPO, that's an electronics officer position. You'll be looking for that maybe on board a ship. You could be going anywhere, it could be in a merchant marine or private shipping company. Mate DPO, that means you'll be under the first officer. That's a very important one because that could be the first officer will be signing off, but that's kind of an apprentice position. Many ships require two GMDSS operators, so the mate DPO could be the second one in command if you're not that fully experienced. Deck watch officer could also be the same as an entry level office position, and it comes through because it is there for uh, working under the authority of someone that has more experience. Third mate, the same thing, another entry level position, but requires a GMDSS because some ships may want three GMDSS operators. It depends on the company and the type of mission. Some of your scientific vessels have three GMDSS people on board. All right, here's what we have talked about today. We covered the Forbes study and we covered the reason why the Forbes study is important, especially verification of credentials. We covered how the ionosphere operates. That was our second category. Three, we covered grow jobs and we covered GMDSS jobs. I also want you to look at the QR codes for purchase on our website. Now, what are we going to be talking about in the next webinar? Well, this webinar covered how the ionosphere works. So our next webinar is going to be starting a series. The first one will be how receivers work. That'll be webinar 5 coming out in 2 weeks. And then following that will be how transmitters work. That'll be webinar 6. And then webinar 7 will be covering the various modes of communication. and those modes of communication, such as how AM, how single sideband, how FM works, and so on and so forth. So those will be the next three. Then we've got a lot more to cover after that. So that will give you a very good idea as to what we're going to be covering. So as you stay tuned for these various webinars, we've got many, many more planned up in the future to provide you a solid foundation for taking the FCC test. So as we wrap it up this week, I thank everyone who has taken the time to listen. Please look at our QR codes and the purchase of our manuals. We look forward to having you at our next webinar. So have a pleasant day and play this as many times as you need. And we certainly hope that this information is helpful. Charles Pascal signing off from the boat in the Marina del Rey.